Greetings. Good afternoon. We're finishing Psalm 66 today, and it is a uh, Psalm 66 is a interesting psalm. I believe, a hymnic psalm of praise is what we said last time, wasn't it? Let me just check it real quick. Uh, yeah, a hymn of praise. Now there's going to be. I think I found some structure here which makes sense of the last part. Um, a psalm would start off in praise. That makes a lot of sense. And um, I should not psalm. I'm sorry. A hymn would start off with praise. That makes sense. And I think what the psalmist is trying to do is maybe make sense of what goes on in his life in response to what he knows about God. So in Psalm 66, we start off with um, like the whole earth singing glory and praise to his name. How awesome are your deeds. All the earth worships you. Comes to what God has done. And then it gets to, so it's kind of just talking about general ideas of power and strength. The whole world honors him as father, respects him, worships him. But then he gets more particular. He talks about the Red Sea crossing and um, rebellious exalt himself. Like oftentimes they would, well, not oftentimes, they would march the Ark of the Covenant into battle and the Lord would fight for his people. So, it's kind of like God of creation doing all these creation things, and it's narrowing and narrowing and narrowing. Not, his power is not narrowing, but like the focus is narrowing. Then we get to more personal, how God is doing majestic deeds, but now on a personal sense in my own life. And then we get to verses 8 through 12. We had the first inkling that even though God is powerful and glorious, the persons in the story are perhaps not, right? We get this who has kept our soul among the living. In other words, we were kind of the mercy of death. We could die at any time. No, he's kept us alive, right, among the living. And then he has not let our feet slip, right? We haven't stumbled and fell. Then he goes into verse 10 through 12, talking about being tested and tried. Um, for you, O God, have tested us. You have tried us as silver is tried. You brought us into the net. You laid a crushing burden on our backs. You let men ride over our heads and went through fire and through water. Yet you have brought us out to a place of abundance. So I think the psalmist here is trying to make sense of, if God is majestic and powerful, which we can all agree, he's the Lord of Lords. He is the creator of all things. He is Yahweh. He's the God of Jacob, of Isaac, of Abraham. Right? I mean, he's all these things. He, of course, creation is such an amazing thing. You stand in awe of the universe, the galaxy, the solar system, the moon and stars, our planet, the breadth or the amount of different things that are alive in the world, the trees, the plants, the animals, the different kinds of locales. So I hope you're seeing it. I'm going from large macro to micro here, right? And then the wonderful gifts that we have, the intricacy of the human body, how it comes to be, the structure of things at a subatomic level. Like it's just, we can narrow and become more and more personal, more and more micro, and still his glory is there. The psalmist, I think, is trying to make sense of the idea that if God is this powerful thing, why is it that him, or I should say me, that's what I'm going to say, me, his chosen people, his chosen children, why is it that we are suffering? Now, see, there's the question. Like in the face of a majestic God, why would, or powerful, or the Creator Yahweh, why is it that I am struggling if He is my Lord? Which we can all agree. In other words, um, The subjects of the Lord should be protected from anything that the Lord can protect them from. If and our God is infinitely powerful, so he can provide infinite protection. So then the question is, well, if he can provide infinite protection, and he is disposed towards me, he has grace and mercy towards me, why are things befalling me? Right? It's a question. And now, of course, we actually were talking about as a confirmation last night. The primary reason why bad things are befalling me is because sin has come into the world through Adam and Eve. Right? This is not what God intended, and sin wrecks, and God then curses. Sorry, I got something in my eye. God curses creation, right? Adam's work brings him toil and burden. Eve's bearing of children brings her increased pain and suffering. And the devil is cursed above all livestock to slither on the ground forever. I mean, these are curses that are laid down in Genesis. So the psalmist makes sense of the suffering that that he's going through, and that Israel's going through. He makes sense of it, that it is God testing us, or we might say, what's the word? We're in kind of a crucible to burn away the dross or the unwanted things, right? If you're not, I only design your dross to consume, your gold to refine. He wants to refine us. This is the. I don't think this is the answer to suffering. I think it's a answer to suffering, and it's a psalmist answer to suffering in the face of a powerful God. Right? This is his answer. Well, we're going through these things because the Lord is testing us and trying us, and I think it's really interesting, right? Where he says at the very beginning, verse 9 of this section, I should say, he kept our soul among the living, right? Like we suffered, but we didn't die. And then verse, let's see here. I was thinking of, well, I suppose verse 13 is as good as anything. The idea that through all of this, I'll still be able to come to your house, worship there, offer sacrifices, things like that. Okay. So I was kind of looking at, talking about a structure. And I think I was kind of laying it out here where you have this praise section in the beginning, and then you have this B section where he's trying to make sense of suffering. And these are verses 10 and 12 and 8 and 10. And then we get down to here where he goes into this next section where it talks about going to the Lord's house. That's going to be our thing for today. I want to put it in its context. And then we get to I think really what's going on here is that he's allowing me to come into his home, his house, to receive forgiveness. And then I end in the same place that I started, right? I'm going to praise. So let's take a look at that. Psalm 66, he has this section where he kind of basically recaps or retells the story of the suffering that they're going through. And he's not very specific. Maybe it's not even like, it's not the same as like a lament psalm where you're talking about specific sufferings, trying to make sense of them in your life. Like, why are these things happening? But it might just be a larger sense of, why does a perfect, glorious, powerful God allow for evil things to happen? And they're just basic kind of evil stuff coming out of the world, right? It's interesting too that in this section where he's talking about suffering, he doesn't refer to anybody beyond Israel, right? The peoples. He's not talking. He never uses that term in that sense that this suffering is for them, but rather that these difficult things are meant to refine us. And when he says us, he means the people of God, right? So I think we can see from observation that we've seen non-Christians who have suffered. That's not in question, right? But the psalmist is saying maybe he's just not concerned with that. He's not interested in answering that question. I think it is a reality. But what he's talking about here is God's people go through difficulty. Why is that? When we're God's people, we cling to Him. He is our Lord. We call Him our Lord and our God. We are His subjects. We are His children. Why is it that we are experiencing these things? And that's His answer for God's people who are asking the question in the first place, right? So we get into verse 13. It's definitely a change of subject. There's no Salah, which is interesting, right? It almost feels like a change of subject. I'm a little curious. It's interesting how sometimes these Bibles will actually lay them out on the page visually, and there's a break in the ESV, but I think it's only because of the formatting. I'd like to see it in the NIV, because what I've found when I use the original languages as well is that oftentimes how they put things on the page, they're trying to reinforce how they're put on the page in the Hebrew Bible. And we assume how they group things on the page was a thought process of not the original writers. Now the original writers were written in just one big block of text, but what would have been the Masoretes were a Jewish community in about 300 AD, right? Closer to Jesus and to the Old Testament than we are, right? Now, not necessarily contemporaries, but they probably had a better grasp on the original. They probably had a better grasp on how the stories are meant to be told and how the poetry is meant to be read than maybe we do, right? So the Masoretes wrote these things and edited them in ways to reinforce. So yeah. So there's a gap here between 12 and 13 as well. And so it makes me think that there might be a gap in here too. And the gap would just maybe subtly, it's not as good as a Salah, but the gap would subtly reinforce the idea that there's a change of subject here. That's what I really want to get at. Does the psalmist mean for it to connect directly to the next thing, or does he mean for you to kind of take a breath, take a moment, and maybe go in a different track? Just not like completely off the rails, but just slightly change gears, right? So Psalm 66. Now in the Hebrew, there is a slight space that they give, and they don't actually here. If you want to see this, if I can get you close enough to it so you can read it. It's right above my finger here between 12 and 13. See that right here? And there really is no space between the two verses. So what I'm going to say is that I don't know if we have a ton of evidence to suggest that this is a change of thought, but it definitely contextually, in other words, what's there, what the scriptures is actually saying, seems like there's a change of thought here, right? So we've got this idea of, yet you brought us out to a place of abundance. I think that would be our hinge point. We were people who were kind of crushed and ridden over, and now you brought us to a place of abundance. And where is that place? That is the temple. That is your house. That is a place we can go and in the midst of the difficult things that are going on, we can find you and be in close communion with you, be in your presence, right? So verse 13. which is our starting place for today. Sorry, that was a lot of catch up just to try to get us in the right place. Abo, Beteka, Be'alot, Asalim, Leka, Nedare. Bo is the word for to go, and abo would be if this is a very basic going word with the first person here. It couldn't be more straightforward. I will go. Beteka, bait would be house. Beteka would be your house, right? So I will go. So we would like the into would be assumed, right? I will go into your house with burnt offerings. So in other words, the psalmist isn't going to come into the Lord's house empty-handed, and burnt offerings would assume that the person is coming in a humble sense. Like I don't come to the Lord with my hands empty. I have reason to bring sacrifices. Sacrifices were typically, I mean, they're not all for sin offerings, but the overarching majority of them are, right? You can go in for a thank offering for a good thing. There are other offerings that are not necessarily sin offerings, but the primary ones that are done are for sins of a personal nature, or me against God, or sins in a communal nature, me against another person. And we would both be there, and that offering would be to kind of reconcile between the two of us. Either way, then we would, like, not in this context, or not in this vein, but the firstborn son, right, is redeemed with a sacrifice. And the idea being is that the Lord spared all our firstborn sons, but the firstborn sons of Egypt died because of what? Sin, right? I mean, there's just so the overall majority. I think we could maybe assume that since he's bringing burnt offerings, he's doing so because he is. He probably, the Old Testament view wouldn't be necessarily the same kind of idea that we have of being sinful, but probably would be the idea of like being unclean, maybe being unrighteous, needing to be made clean, made righteous, and we would understand that probably more of a theological sense. This would almost be like a nephesh kind of thing, like a whole person. So they would, I think it's true that we carry our sin in our body, but we don't think about it that way. We think about sin being primarily a mental, spiritual thing. Whereas a Jewish person, your uncleanliness not only affects your mental state and your spiritual state, but it affects your physical state too. You can't touch certain things, you can't go certain places with your body because you're unclean, right? It's a different kind of idea. But it's still very much connected, right? The two things are connected to evil acts. So he's going to go into the Lord's house and burnt offerings. In other words, he's going to go in and make atonement. He's going to go in and ask for forgiveness. This is what's happening. I will pay you, Asalim, I will pay you my vows. Now, let's look at this word for vow here. Nadar is the root word, and nadar means to make or to make vows, right? Like literally can be just making something. Oftentimes is used in the idea of like made a vow. Okay, now we have to ask ourselves if this is Psalm 66. Let's go back to the beginning. This is to the choir master, a psalm. This is not from David, as far as we know. So we have to ask ourselves, what kind of vows are these, right? The little study note here in verse 13, burnt offerings, kings usually offered whole burnt offerings. The whole burnt offering would be that you would burn up the entire animal, and then there wouldn't be anything left for, like in a reconciliation offering, oftentimes they would burn up the fattest parts or the choicest parts, and then they would eat the rest of it between the two to show kind of reconciliation between the whole family and everything else. We'd eat that offering in the place of the Lord. But to show high trust and also due to your high place as a king, let's say, a whole burnt offering. So you just burn up everything. In other words, I'm going to devote this entirely to the Lord. None of this is for me. All of it is for God, right? So verse 13. The whole burnt offering would have been a visible expression of a vow of loyalty. And it says, see P7. I'm not sure if that's page 7 or if it can't be page 7. That wouldn't make any sense. Let's see if there's anything on page 7. No, page 7 is not it. Well, maybe. Vow. Here we go. Nadir, a peace offering by which a worshiper is bound to God with a promise, a thank offering, requesting God's favor and praising Him for success in fulfilling a promise. A vow and its offering are not distinguished. Clean animals or even service was offered with a vow. Both men and women made such vows. Okay. Bound to God with a promise. We don't get a lot of so we let's look at this. I want to look at this real quick. The Psalm background is 2 Kings 19. 2 Kings 19, 8-37, and it's the deliverance of Hezekiah. When the field commander heard that the king of Assyria had left Lachish, he withdrew and found the king fighting against Libnah. Now Sennacherib received a report that Tircano, the king of Cush, was marching out to fight against him, so he sent messengers to Hezekiah with this word. Say to Hezekiah, king of Judah, do not let the God you depend on deceive you when he says Jerusalem will not be given into the hands of the king of Assyria. Surely you have heard what the kings of Assyria have done to all the countries, destroying them completely. And will you be delivered? The gods of the nations that were destroyed by my predecessors deliver them, the gods of Gozan, Haran, Rezeph, and the people of Eden who were in Tel Assar. Where is the king of Hamath or the king of Arpad? Where are the kings of Lair, Sepharvaim, Hena, and Iva? He went to as Hezekiah received the letter, he went out to the temple of the Lord and spread it before the Lord. And Hezekiah prayed to the Lord, Lord God of Israel, enthroned between the cherubim. You alone are God over all the kingdoms of the earth. You have made heaven and earth. Give ear, Lord, and hear. Open your eyes and see. Listen to the words Sennacherib has sent to ridicule the living God. It is true, Lord, that the Assyrian kings have laid waste to these nations. They have thrown their gods into the fire and destroyed them. For they were not gods, but only of wood and stone fashioned by human hands. Now, Lord, our God, deliver us from his hand, so that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone, Lord, are God. Then Isaiah, son of Amoz, sent a message to Hezekiah. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. So Hezekiah goes up to the temple. I wonder where he was. It doesn't say where in the temple he went. He's not a high priest. He wouldn't be allowed in the holy place or the most holy place. So he spreads out this word from Sennacherib. This is the word that the Lord has spoken against him. This is what Isaiah tells him. Virgin daughter Zion despises you and mocks you. Daughter Jerusalem tosses her head as you flee. Who is it you have ridiculed and blasphemed? Against whom have you raised your voice and lifted your eyes in pride? Against the Holy One of Israel. By your messengers you have ridiculed the Lord, and you have said with many chariots, I have ascended the heights of the mountains. I'll just keep going here. I have dug wells in foreign lands. With the soles of my feet I have dried up all the streams in Egypt. Because you rage against, I'm skipping a lot here just to keep it short. Because you rage against me, because your insolence has reached my ears, I will put my hook in your nose and bit in your mouth, and I will make you return by the way you came. This will be the sign for you, Hezekiah. This year you will eat what grows by itself, and the second year what springs from that. But in the third year, sow and reap, plant vineyards and eat their fruit. Once more, a remnant of the kingdom of Judah will take root and bear fruit above. For out of Jerusalem will come a remnant, and out of Mount Zion a band of survivors. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. The king of Assyria will not enter the city or shoot an arrow here. He will not come before it with shield or build a siege ramp against it. By the way that he came, he will return. He will not enter the city, declares the Lord. I will defend the city and save it for my sake and for the sake of David's servant. That night the angel of the Lord went out and put to death 185,000 in the Assyrian camp. When the people got up the next morning, there were all the dead bodies. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, broke camp and withdrew. He returned to Nineveh and stayed there. One day while he was worshiping in the temple of his god Nisroch, his sons Adramelech and Sharezer killed him with the sword, and they escaped to the land of Ararat, and Shaddan, his son, succeeded him as king. So Sennacherib gets killed by his own sons. Let's see here. I want to go back a chapter just to get a sense of it. Yeah. So, chapter 18. In the 14th year of King Hezekiah's reign, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, attacked all the fortified cities of Judah and captured them. So, Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent this message. Blah, blah, blah. Yeah, here it is. The king of Assyria sent his supreme commander, his chief officer, and his field commander with a large army from Lachish to King Hezekiah at a large army at Jerusalem. They came up to Jerusalem and stopped at the aqueduct of the upper pool on the road to the washings. So the Assyrian army has come to Jerusalem. They've already sacked a bunch of cities in Judah, and Hezekiah does what's right. He takes the letter of Sennacherib. He goes to God and he prays to God to help him, and God does, and defeats Sennacherib. So that could be, some people are suggesting, the background of our psalm, which makes sense then when we get to what's happening in 13 to 14. So now Hezekiah, in light of what's happened to the camp of Sennacherib, he's going to come into the Lord's house, perform vows, and honor. Probably the vow for King Hezekiah would be to lead his people faithfully. That's Hezekiah's vow. As king, he's supposed to, kind of be king, but be king in a faithful way, as opposed to the evil kings who did not honor the Lord, who did not love the Lord. Right. So in other words, he's just going to be king, but he's going to do it in the right way. That's his vow. He's going to serve to the Lord, and perhaps other things as well. Right. Maybe there are personal vows, like how he's going to take care of his wife and his children, and there could be things like that as well. Right. This makes sense that when he's talking about kingly vows, the burnt offering is this word referring back to kind of kingly offerings or large offerings. Perform my vows, that which my lips uttered and my mouth promised when I was in trouble. I will offer to you. I want to go back here to chapter 18 for a moment. So then in verse chapter 19. right? So first of all, Hezekiah calls a fast and for people to put on sackcloth and ashes in a sign of repentance, right? He goes and he spreads that letter out before the Lord. Deliver us from your hand. Yeah, I'm trying to see if he offers up, if Hezekiah himself offers up a vow of like something he's going to do specifically in this instance if God delivers them. I'm not seeing anything. He held fast. So it's describing Hezekiah. Trust in the Lord, the God of Israel. There is no one like him among all the kings of Judah, either before him or after him. He held fast to the Lord and did not stop following him. He kept the commands the Lord had given Moses, and the Lord was with him. He was successful in whatever he undertook. He rebelled against the king of Assyria and did not serve him. From watchtower to fortified city, he defeated the Philistines as far as Gaza and its territory. So maybe in a Davidic sense, like he's going to take care of the Philistines in the land. He's going to be a king by all extents. Looks like that rules justly. It says he tore down the high places, he tore down the idols, he outlawed and forbade worshiping of other gods. So these might be the vows that he's said he's going to take, right? Okay, well let's keep going. Verse 15. Let's jump to there. Alot me'im ala lak im ketoret elim ese bakar im atudim salah. Burnt sacrifices of fattened animals I will offer you, with the sweet aroma of rams. With the sweet aroma. Not sure. Trying to figure out where the something like burnt sacrifices of fattened animals I will offer you sweet aromas. I'm guessing that might be incense. I will offer rams, bulls, and goats. Let's see how it translates this. I will offer to you burnt offerings of fattened animals with the smoke of the sacrifice. Okay, so they're connecting the sweet aroma with whenever offerings are offered up, not every single time, but often the Bible refers to the smell of burnt offerings of burnt animals as being a sweet aroma to God that pleases him. It's strange when you think about it, because burnt flesh does not usually create a nice pleasing smell. So I think the idea here is it's pleasing because a fattened animal in an ancient culture, so we are a culture that overindulges, right? It's different for us, but in an ancient culture where you're probably malnutritioned just in general, everyone is. A fattened animal is an incredible store of energy. It's something to be sought after. It'll keep you alive for a very long time. It's good for everyone, right? It's a high concentration of food value, right? There's a lot of value to it. And what it means then is when you're willing to sacrifice the thing that could be very advantageous to you, it's a sign of trust. It's a sign that what does any father want? A father wants his children to trust him. There's nothing that brings me joy more than when my children are thankful for the things that I provide. We're sitting at the dinner table and they say, thank you for dinner. And they say, we go to a restaurant, they say, thank you for bringing us to this place, or this, Esro says, thank you for bringing us to this yummy place. But the idea that they understand that this is a blessing and then they thank you for it, and there's nothing that brings you more joy. So I have to imagine that the smell of animals is sweet because because the Lord takes joy that the people trust him, that if he provides once, he will provide always. I can put my trust in him that he'll provide forever and not worry about what happens tomorrow, right? It's a sign of faith and trust, right? So that's why it's sweet. I will offer bulls and goats, right? So it kind of reminds me, and it makes sense if it's Hezekiah. It reminds me of like how Solomon used to give offerings. If you ever read like any of the stories of Solomon, when he would offer things, he would offer a lot, like hundreds of bulls and rams and goats. I mean, just like these sacrifices must have gone on forever. How long it must have took to do all this, and the smell. Can you imagine? I mean, we're talking about whole packs of animals being burned, but also if it's not a Holocaust offering, which means when everything's burnt up, if it's not a Holocaust offering, then you've got like a lot of extra food for people to eat. So this is like one heck of a celebration as well, if it is that case. So it reminds me of that. It reminds me of like how Solomon would do things. Yeah. Um, so going through these difficult times, that's in the psalm, and then we can also maybe apply the historical context, perhaps. uh, there's a lot of joy in being able to go back to church. I think we can identify with this in terms of if you ever gone through any long illnesses, any long difficulties, and the joy it is to go back to church. Or perhaps someone who is in the Army Reserve or something, and they go and they serve for a long period of time, and they come home and they get to return. Or anybody who takes a fairly long vacation away from your home and your place of worship. Not that you can't worship other places, but there is something to it when you return to your home place of worship and worship with your brothers and sisters whom you've known for a long time, and the joy that's there, right? Um, I I don't know if we can necessarily understand it, but maybe it's something that would be more appropriate would be like if you're down in Florida or some place like that where a hurricane comes, and then there was a situation kind of like this when I was growing up. We were in Grand Forks, and so '94 there was a huge flood. I remember down in St. Louis there was a bad flood. I think in like I want to say in the '90s too, in on the Mississippi, and it was just really like so when a flood happens or a natural disaster, a hurricane happens, right? I think things just kind of break down. It's kind of like a snowstorm, but worse, right? Like when we have a snowstorm around here, things kind of shut down for a day or two, but usually it's not that long. With the hurricane, I remember hearing stories about the flood in '94 in Grand Forks that like pretty much every restaurant in town was down, and none of the grocery stores were open either, and the food that they had was contaminated by water. So I remember them telling me, I worked at an Applebee's. I remember one guy telling me that when that flood happened, they were working like 24-hour shifts just to keep up with the amount of people who needed food. And that when you have those basic services break down too, then you probably maybe churches cancel. Maybe you're not meeting with regular. I remember there was a church not too long ago here in South Dakota, Delmont, that got destroyed by a tornado. Well, what do you do the day after the tornado goes through and tears down your church? Do you worship? Do you not? Do you go somewhere else? Right? You see the idea of being able to return to your home house of worship and worship the Lord is a joyful thing. So that's why we're having such extreme sacrifice. It's a sacrifice out of joy. Things are going back to normal, or maybe they're going to be better, right? We're going to rejoice because the calamity that befall us is now over. Yeah. So we get into 16. Come and hear. I'm sorry, I'll read the Hebrew for you. Leku simu va'asapera, I believe. Call Yireh Elohim Aser Asa Lenapsi. Shema, actually, it's Shemu. I screwed that up. It's not Simu. It's not a sound. So come and hear and I will declare, all you who fear God, what he has done for my nephesh. So the king, if this is the historical context of the psalm, Hezekiah is going to go into the Lord's temple, the Lord's house, and he's going to sacrifice, and he's going to proclaim everything good that the Lord has done. That's fun stuff. Yeah. We have moments like this. I mean, every church service really should be this. But those days were perhaps like some of the most joyful days in the church I've found are like, of course, Easter, Christmas. Yeah. Then you put in top of that, you put in that group as well, like when a church has gone through a vacancy and it calls a pastor and the pastor comes. That's pretty exciting. Or when a church celebrates a really large milestone, like 75, 100 years, things like this, they get excited as well. And it's a time of great joy. Maybe it's something I need to reflect on too as a pastor. Do we come into the Lord's house any Sunday and experience joy like this? It'd be hard though, because I think this joy comes out of a circumstance that isn't repeatable. We can't necessarily defeat Sennacherib and have that kind of joy. But yeah, I think there's moments like this where we feel this kind of elation as to what God has done. It's not often, but sometimes. Okay, 17. Elah pi karati vero'omam tahat leso ni. So basically, to him with my mouth I cried, but it'd probably be more appropriate, like I cried to him with my mouth. Put the subject and the verb, and then the object and indirect object. Or it probably wouldn't be indirect object. It's not a to him with. Yeah, it would be the indirect object. And he was extolled with my tongue. So extolled is an interesting word. Let's take a look at that. It's kind of a different word for praise. Yes, we have extol. The definition of extolling or praising. Yeah, let's look up the root. The primitive root is room, which is to be high or exalted or to be lifted, literally to be kind of raised up, right? So I will exalt him, extol him. I will raise him up. I will kind of, in a mental sense, right? The Lord, definitely a word for praise. So he's gonna tell everyone what God has done. In verse 16, he's going to cry out to him with his, now not crying in like a crying way, but cry out, like scream out, yell out, cry out to the Lord with his mouth and praise him with his tongue. Which is cool because James talks about our tongues being a place of fire and unrighteousness. Well, let's look at the verse specifically. I don't want to misquote it. Let's see here. James 3. Let's see. I want to find the exact verse. The tongue also is a fire, a world of evil among the parts of the body. It corrupts the whole body, sets the whole course of one's life on fire, and it itself is set on fire by hell. The tongue is a small part of the body, but it makes great boasts. So the cool thing is that the tongue can be a place of fire and insults and wrath, evil, or it can be a place of praise and lifting up of God's name. Not that God's name needs to be lifted up, right? He doesn't need our help, but this is what God's people do. They lift up God's name. They praise his name. They make it high. They make it worthy of honor. In people's sight, right? Like we don't lift his name up, but rather we lift it up in the sense of everyone else looking at it. Look at this thing. Look at God's name. Look at Yahweh. Look at what he's done. He's amazing. And then everyone looks at him. That's what it means to kind of lift it up, to praise it, to cry out to him. So it's interesting that a tongue can be either good or bad. And it seems that the difference is what the tongue is focused on talking about. If the tongue is focused on talking about the glory of the Lord, then it can do great things. But if the tongue is focused on self or hate of the Lord, well, then it's the root of all evil, and it's the fires of hell. And it's in your mouth. It reminds me of Jesus. Like out of the mouth comes all sorts of evil and licentiousness. Right? He's like, evil comes out of man. It's in us, right? Nothing is food going in or coming out doesn't make a man clean. It's the words it's the thoughts, it's the sin that comes out of his mouth that makes him unclean. So anyway, just some thoughts to throw out there. Verse 18, Aven im ra'ati belabi lo yisma Adonai. Adonai is another word for Lord. You probably recognize it. So Aven, iniquity. I think it's something like, if I regard iniquity in my heart, I will not hear the Lord. Or maybe regard, I think would maybe like admire or see. It's saying see. That's weird. It's saying see. Ra'ati. Yeah. Huh. I suppose it's like a sense of like lifting it up to look at it, admire it. You know. I'm guessing that it, like seeing or regarding iniquity in my heart, would be kind of considering or like considering in a negative way or thinking about doing evil stuff, iniquity, right? Let's see what we have here in the ESV. This is verse 18. If I had cherished iniquity in my heart. Yeah, that's actually not a bad translation. It kind of gets at the root meaning. It's definitely not there specifically. Like it's definitely a translation. It's a choice. Well, that's what I mean to say. Like it's definitely a choice there. What do we have? We have letter B. It's talking about Job 36:21 for the word cherished iniquity. Let's look at that one. Job 36. This is a weird kind of way to talk. So I want to make sure I'm kind of on the right track here. Psalms. Actually, I think Job is before the Psalms. Yeah. Okay. Job 36:21. Okay. Take care, do not turn to iniquity, for this you have chosen rather than affliction. 21. Okay. Turn to iniquity. Yeah. So I think it's like looking at with the idea of wanting to do it, right? Now it's not exactly there, but I think putting see it together with in my heart would give you the idea of considering it or thinking about doing it. Cherished. Yeah. Iniquity in my heart, the Lord would not have listened. Yeah. And I think the listen is to verse 17 and 16, right? Or probably just verse 17, right? When he's crying to the Lord and he's extolling with his tongue. Well, if I'd have been a person who loved iniquity, he wouldn't have heard me. And if we're going with the historical context of the psalm, the suggested, we don't know for certain, that would make sense because Hezekiah is crying out to the Lord for help against King Sennacherib. So in other words, if he had been a man who was his only motivations were fear of death or something nefarious, as opposed to trusting the Lord and wanting him to be God alone, the Lord wouldn't have listened to him, right? I think of like something like King Saul, and he's going to fight, and he has men that are kind of slowly deserting him. He's fearful of the battle, so he kind of takes matters in his own hands. He doesn't wait for Samuel to show up, and Samuel rebukes him, and Saul ends up losing the fight. So Saul loses because his heart's not really there. If he truly would have honored the Lord, he would have waited for Samuel, and that's not what happens here. Hezekiah truly believes in God, and so the Lord delivers him. Right? And he wouldn't have if Hezekiah was a man who considered iniquity in his heart. Like, not that Hezekiah is perfect or that he's not sinful, but his motivations are of faith. Right? He's motivated by faith. He's motivated by trust in the Lord. Right? Okay, so 19. Aken sama Elohim hiksib bekol tapilati. Surely Elohim, he has heard me, God. So surely God has heard me. He has attended to the voice of my prayer. Bekol is a word we come across a lot. The voice of my prayer, tipilati. Yeah. Surely God, I would imagine in the wake of Sennacherib's defeat, knowing that God had heard his prayer and then answered his prayer would have been a very consoling thing. Probably would have made him very happy, right? Baruch Elohim Asher Lo Hesir Tepalati Vahasdo Me'ati I think. Blessed be God, Baruch Elohim. It's a really common phrase. Blessed be God who has not turned away from my prayer, nor his mercy from me. So has not turned away from my prayer, nor has he turned away from his mercy towards me. Or let's see how it translates here. Because he's not rejected my prayer or removed his steadfast love from me. Chesed. Yeah. It has mercy here in this little translation, but yeah, it's been I can't believe I missed it. Vehasdo, it doesn't sound like it, but yeah, it's chesed in the middle. His steadfast love from me. Yeah, good stuff. All right. So my take on this would be, well, it's great, first of all. Second of all, I think we can connect to this in a variety of ways. I think we can imagine this whole psalm, but especially this last section here being said by Christ in his voice. And especially this last section, I think we can understand it, or even just these last few verses, a resurrected Christ, right? The Lord's plans have been fulfilled. Look what he has done. He has defeated the enemy, right? Although Christ really defeated the enemy, but and they both did together. It's the Father's plan. It's the Son's work. Regardless, they have defeated the enemy. I think also this could be our prayer on the last day, seeing what has transpired, what God has done, and we can have joy that he has defeated the enemy in that respect as well. There's lots of ways we can look at this psalm and see it in a variety of ways. What could we take from it? Well, I think the middle section is very helpful in terms of thinking about how we deal with it. It's one way of dealing with the incongruities of life, right? That God is powerful and just, and yet we still suffer iniquity, or we still suffer, right? And probably as a pastor, when you're looking at your people, you're just kind of considering what they have to say to you. One of the best answers is, the Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. A person who still loves God regardless of the sufferings that they're going through, the difficulties that they encounter. And I'll tell you what, I've ran into some people in my life serving them who have not begrudged the Lord, not been angry with him, love the Lord even when they're suffering terrible things. And it's inspiring. It's inspiring to me. It's inspiring that people can be so kind and tender-hearted, can love the Lord with such an abiding love, even when they're going through the worst moments of their life. One of the greatest ones ever for me. And I don't know if Henry Thornton, that little tyke, he loved God. He loved Jesus, even when he was hurting so badly. And just faith, childlike faith or strong faith or true faith, however you want to describe it. It was a beautiful thing to see. It was inspiring. It was a wick that was quickly put out, too quickly put out. But in it, now I'm not going to say that this was a good enough reason for him to suffer. That would be a terrible thing. Like, oh, just because you learned something that was worthy of him to suffer. No, that's not what I'm saying. I don't know why he suffered like he did. I don't. I know this. I learned from him. He changed my life. And everything that his family's gone through as well has changed my life. Now, I'm not going to say that's a good enough reason for him to go through what he went through. But it's kind of like, how does my mom always say that? Or no, it's an old phrase like, we broke the egg, so might at least get an omelet out of it, right? That sounds bad too, though. But the idea that this evil is coming to the world and people suffer, and I don't know why it happens, and it's an awful, terrible thing. But I can learn from it. I can take something from it that might be good in the long run. And it kind of almost makes you think about how good the Lord is. If this person can go through this and have faith in God's promises, despite all the pain and suffering they're going through, that I think to myself, well, that's something. It means something. That God is good. And I can trust in him. So lots of stuff here. Good psalm. Excellent thing to read. So have a wonderful rest of your weekend. Hope to see you in church on Sunday. And God bless you, and may he strengthen your faith.